An American man over 50 journeys deep into the Mongolian steppe encounters a tribe and is astonishingly asked by three sisters to impregnate them to continue their lineage. David Miller, an American man over 50, had worked in the finance department of a rather successful mid-sized company. However, his marriage had long since broken down, and he had endured many hardships in life. One day, he wrapped up his business, deciding to travel the world before it was too late. He had few family ties, and the fact that he had never truly left the United States further spurred him on. After his divorce, his heart was complicated and bewildered. But at 50 years old, he finally packed his bags and embarked on a journey abroad. Initially, he had considered Southeast Asia or Europe, but suddenly, the Mongolian steppe he'd seen in a documentary clearly came to mind. There, the horizon stretched endlessly, and people still led nomadic lives in untouched, wild civilization. David Miller wanted to immerse himself in that landscape. He wanted to feel freedom in a strange land. An acquaintance told him that, besides urban areas, Mongolia had vast grasslands, deserts, and rugged terrain, making travel very difficult. However, the more he heard, the stronger his curiosity grew. He happened to meet a Mongolian language translator in an online community, who informed him that in the western and northwestern regions, there were still some minority tribes with almost no contact with the outside world. Upon arriving in Ulaanbaatar, David Miller slowly began to move westward. He rented a car for his use and learned some basic Mongolian greetings from a translator and dictionary he had prepared in the United States. He anticipated that English proficiency would be low, but he believed there would always be a way to manage. After touring Ulaanbaatar and nearby small towns for a few days, he ventured into more remote areas. As he moved further from the city, the roads became increasingly dilapidated and his cell phone signal vanished. However, David Miller felt more relief than anxiety. It seemed as though the bustling life in the United States, the wounds from his divorce, and the judging eyes of others had all disappeared. Now, it was just him and the vast expanse of land. After driving for several hours on unpaved roads, a desolate landscape suddenly unfolded. Strong winds howled, dust swirled, and there were no signs of villages, except for some dimly visible ridges in the distance. He had brought a certain amount of food, water, and vehicle fuel, but he didn't know when or where a village would appear. A slight fear crept in that he might be isolated in the heart of the steppe. However, from the moment he left, he knew it was a dangerous journey. Wolves or wild dogs roaming the steppe, unpredictable weather, accidents, getting lost, none of it was easy. David Miller opened his map again in the car, trying to find a place where a known landmark might appear, but he had even lost his sense of accurate positioning. Confused by the rugged terrain on this desolate plain, where even a fallen needle would be hard to find, he decided to trust his intuition and continue to be small dots in the distance. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be a small settlement of several yurts. David Miller was exhausted from the hot sun, but seeing this sight, he felt a wave of relief. If this was a cluster of yurts inhabited by Mongolian nomads, he could at least find people, water, and a place to sleep. As he drove closer, he saw about 8 yurts scattered around. Goats and sheep grazed nearby, and people glanced at him. David Miller slowly got out of the car and greeted them in clumsy Mongolian. He tried to greet them in English, hoping it would be understood, but the reaction was a bit awkward. However, it wasn't an atmosphere of outright repulsion. Several people approached and gestured for him to join them. That evening, through clumsy communication, he indicated he was American and traveling. The villagers seemed surprised and offered him roasted lamb and milk tea. David Miller was very grateful and clumsily expressed his goodwill by giving them some American snacks and small souvenirs he carried. This village was a very small tribe. They called themselves Jalan and said they had long lived a nomadic life centered in this region. David Miller couldn't understand the details, but he roughly gathered their situation through a mix of Mongolian, a few English words, and their gestures. There were almost no young men in the village, mostly children, middle-aged and elderly women, and elders. That night, as he slept in one of the yurts, he wondered, why are there no young men? They might have left for the cities too, find work, or there could be other reasons. David Miller simply let it be without any particular suspicion. He still planned to stay for a day or two and then leave. The next morning, the villagers suggested showing him around the village, but David Miller declined. They then gestured to him the well and animal grazing areas, though without fully verbalizing it. Then, in front of one yurt, he discovered 3 young women. He hadn't expected them. They all appeared to be in their early 20s, much younger than David Miller. They looked very similar, but each exuded a different charm. The first had thick black hair, half tied up, and appeared tall and serene. The second had brown hair and an impressively bright smile and seemed very lively. The third had neat braids and quietly exchanged glances. Later, he learned these 3 were sisters, Jalgala, Oyan, and Narin. Respectively, a middle-aged woman in the village seemed to be introducing David Miller to the sisters. When David Miller greeted them, the 3 sisters looked at him with curious expressions and smiled. Notably, the second sister, Oyan, blurted out a short English hello, to which David Miller replied, "Hello, nice to meet you," eliciting a burst of laughter. It seemed English wouldn't be fully understood, but basic greetings were fine. Thus, he naturally had the opportunity to converse with the sisters. Jalgala spoke almost no English, making translation difficult, but Oyan helped out. She had briefly visited Ulaanbaatar in her childhood and had some exposure to English. The third sister, Narin, was shy and spoke little, but she looked at David Miller as one would a stranger. That afternoon, David Miller visited the nearby pastures with the sisters. They also watched the villagers herd livestock across the steppe. Oyan explained the village life in simple English. She mentioned the scarcity of men that most young men had left and gradually told him about the village's ancient traditions. David Miller was curious. "So, how do you marry and have children?" Oyan replied with a subtle expression and a smile. "Our tribe has a special custom. Sometimes we have relations with foreign men to procreate. The details are hard to explain." Jalgala also whispered to her in Mongolian beside her, then gave David Miller a shy smile. At that moment, David Miller felt a chill. There's a custom of having relations with foreign men and bearing children. Here were 3 sisters with almost no young men in the village. He had a ridiculous thought that they might want to ask him to do something similar. However, he just brushed it off as a joke. Could such a thing really happen? Originally, David Miller's plan was to stay in this village for a day or 2, then continue westward. However, the villagers showed warm hospitality, and he wanted to gather more interesting stories while gradually communicating with Oyan. So he decided to stay for a few more days, check his car, and stock up on supplies. Furthermore, the weather on the steppe was unpredictable, so resting for a while was also a good idea. Days passed like this. David Miller grew closer to the 3 sisters. None of the 3 were married, and were the most promising young women remaining in the family. As the eldest daughter, Jalgala, was responsible for faithfully carrying out the livestock management and household chores assigned by the tribal elders, the lively Oyan was curious about external culture and city life. So she constantly asked David Miller about the United States and looked at photos stored on his phone. The youngest, Narin, was quiet, but often had Oyan translate with a gentle smile and a charming tone. Every day, the 3 sisters invited David Miller to their yurt, or around the village, had him sit beside them, and showed him various things. He watched with awe the methods of riding horses or goats, the structure inside the yurts, the process of handling firewood, and the making of traditional Mongolian food, which he experienced for the first time. Among them, Jalgala's meticulous guidance to David Miller was particularly impressive. As the eldest daughter, she tried to explain step by step, and David Miller grew fond of her calm demeanor. One day, at a casual gathering, many village women and some elders watched David Miller and burst into laughter. David Miller didn't know why, but it seemed they were talking about him. Oyan, standing next to him, smiled and said, "Foreign men are precious here, especially since there are almost no young men. The villagers think you're remarkable." David Miller smiled awkwardly and nodded. However, Oyan stated frankly, "If you allow, we can hold a special ceremony in our village and have children." This left David Miller bewildered. In an instant, his heart sank as he understood what this implied. While it was too early to make hasty assumptions, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sisters might all want him to stay and have children. A few days later, David Miller was invited to the Three Sisters yurt. Before that, he had mainly stayed in a middle-aged couple's yurt, but the sisters requested a long talk in their yurt that night. Jalgala prepared a special soup using ingredients difficult to obtain in the city. The soup, full of lamb and vegetables, tasted better than he expected, which impressed David Miller. After the meal, David Miller and the three sisters drank tea in the dimly lit yurt, engaging in a fervent conversation, Oryan in English. This village has a very ancient family tradition. Due to the absolute shortage of men, when an outsider comes in, he is treated with certain kindness. If the man is willing, several women, such as three sisters or two sisters, will simultaneously form a relationship with him and bear children. If the man is willing, he can stay with the tribe or leave. The man doesn't have to feel burdened by his children remaining in the village. Does such a custom truly exist? Some people in the world had heard that such things occasionally happened, even in some remote parts of Mongolia. But experiencing it directly, he felt it was surreal. But Jalgala added, "We are three sisters. Each of us lives alone, and in fact, without young men, it's hard for our families to survive. I know this would be a burden for you, but it would be wonderful if we could have children together." This was indeed a bold proposition, but all three sisters wanted to have his children. David Miller felt embarrassed and thought to himself, "I'm over 50. This is impossible in America. Besides, I don't know how I'd take responsibility if I actually had children." Oryan, hearing this, said, "We can't force you to stay. This is just an option. If you wish, you can live with us or you can leave. This is how we've always lived." He had anticipated some of it, but was still shocked to hear it. The three sisters looked at David Miller with slightly shy expressions. Naren seemed to be quietly lowering her head. Her ears slightly reddened. All three had beautiful features and healthy complexions, exuding an exotic charm. When dressed in traditional Mongolian attire, it was incredible that such sisters simultaneously wanted him to father their children and that this was a custom permitted by the village. David Miller sighed, saying, "I can't refuse, but I can't accept immediately either. This proposal is too unusual." Jalgala nodded and said, "We usually don't make such suggestions to foreigners. In fact, long ago, an outsider had a child this way and left. But since then, no men have come for a long time, so we don't want to miss this opportunity either." Oryan said, "Don't feel burdened. If you truly don't want to, you can leave now." David Miller hesitated and asked for some time. The three sisters understood, saying, "Please stay a while longer and consider it carefully." However, the village atmosphere already seemed filled with anticipation, as if a foreign man had finally entered their family. He had the impression that if he stayed a few more days, a wedding would naturally take place. His heart was complex. First, he wasn't accustomed to such unconventional relationships. Was absurd. Moreover, he worried about how he would take responsibility if he actually had children. Of course, the tribe allowed men to leave, but David Miller was tormented by the thought of whether he should abandon his own children and depart, however. Even if he completely refused, David Miller's own situation was a problem. Back in the United States, he had no special relationships, nor stable work or wealth. If he settled here and started a new life, adapting to the Mongolian language or lifestyle wouldn't be easy. But freely building a family on the steppe was a unique option. The three sisters were beautiful and had shown him warm hospitality. David Miller had already grown comfortable with them and secretly developed feelings for them. One day, Jalgala quietly visited the yurt where he was staying. It was after everyone else had fallen asleep. Jalgala seemed somewhat reserved during the day, but when she spoke quietly at night, she was surprisingly candid. She said, "I know you're over 50, but that's not an issue in the village. Women have united with older men before. What we need is a healthy child to continue the family and trust in a man." David countered, "Are you really okay with this? I'm old, and my body might not be as healthy as it used to be." Jalgala laughed and said, "I don't think you're past your prime." After talking with Jalgala late into the night, David Miller felt his heart gradually opening. Among the three sisters, Jalgala possessed a cautious and responsible charm, like an eldest daughter. If he were to live here, he also imagined building a family in cooperation with Jal Galadot in the following days. Oyan approached David Miller more actively. She was very curious about what the United States was like. David Miller was surprised by this unexpected answer and asked, "Could you really abandon this village?" Oyan smiled vaguely and said, "Jalgala will protect the village, and Narin isn't. Sure yet, but I'm curious about cities and foreign lands." Narin still didn't say much, but her face would quickly redden when David Miller was nearby. When they were alone, David Miller's heart pounded, and Narin softly mumbled, "I like you too," in a very faint and gentle voice. After all, no more specific words were exchanged, but in that moment, his whole body was filled with excitement. He felt that even without words, he could refuse the three sisters' request and leave. They had said that, without men, it would be difficult to have children, and the family would gradually decline. Even if children were born afterward, the sisters and the village community would care for them, so he wouldn't need to bear the burden. To grow in his 50 years of life, he had never imagined such a thing. In the United States, such a thing would be highly illegal, and publicly condemned a man marrying three sisters simultaneously was absurd. But here, it was a natural custom. Moreover, the three sisters were all pure and beautiful. They were very amiable. Most importantly, David Miller himself was tired of his past work life and married life and wanted to find a new life. So perhaps this was destiny. Finally, he conveyed his intentions to the three sisters through "If you truly wish it, and if I am capable, I will follow that custom." Upon hearing these words, the three sisters were overjoyed, embracing him and covering their eyes. It was as if a long-standing mission had been resolved. David Miller tried to remain calm on the surface, but his heart was pounding. The thought of what he was doing swept through his body. After that, the village elders immediately began preparations. They would share food like a simple festival, playing traditional music and dancing. This case was somewhat unusual. A man marrying three sisters simultaneously was rare. But this also meant that this family could be grandly welcomed. One day, a large bonfire was lit in the center of the steppe. Elders and women representing the families sat in a circle, beating drums and other percussion instruments and reciting words of congratulations. About 30 villagers gathered, and the three sisters surrounded David Miller in the center. They wore coats similar to traditional attire, without complex decorations, but adorned with bright Mongolian-style colors. The ceremony wasn't long. The elders simply spoke a few words of congratulations. The brides bowed gently to David Miller, and then circulated cups. David Miller also drank a golden beverage like the village's traditional wine. His stomach grew warm. People clapped their hands with joyful smiles, and the drum beats grew louder. Lamb, bread, and milk tea were immediately served. Several people had already come here and arranged it meticulously. They had created a space large enough for the three sisters and one man to live together. David Miller, with a slightly flushed face, said, "Jalgala, from today on, you will live with us." Oyan then smiled and said, "From now on, we are a family. Isn't that wonderful?" Narin quietly nodded, but her eyes sparkled as night deepened. Moonlight and lantern light flickered within the yurt. The three sisters sat beside David Miller, one by one, a night unimaginable in his former American life. David Miller nodded with a nervous yet excited heart. Their cohabitation thus began. The first few days were unfamiliar and cautious, but gradually settled into a routine. Also chatted together. Jalgala had a serious and guardian-like presence. Oyan was energetic and charming, while Narin was shy but would occasionally give him a friendly physical touch. For David Miller, every day was a heart-pounding one. Of what would happen about a month later, David began to live with the sisters and actively participate in village affairs. When the sisters were mobilized to feed livestock, maintain yurts, fetch water, and harvest herbs in the mountains, he also worked alongside them. In the process, he often heard people jokingly say that he was now completely their family's son-in-law. He also felt the village atmosphere trying to accept him like a brother, regardless of age. Sometimes, Jalgala would take David Miller to the steppe to practice horseback riding. The vast land and sky seemed to merge. David Miller recalled his previous life in the United States, buried among skyscrapers, and thought it was the first time he had felt such freedom. Oyan was always smiling and often asked David Miller, "Do you have American food?" Show me American. Pop music videos on your smartphone. Since there was no internet signal in the village, he could only show saved files. Oyan watched the videos with great interest and happily said, "I want to wear clothes like that too." David Miller said, "If I have the chance to go back to the United States, I'll definitely take you." And Oyan's eyes lit up, shouting, "Promise." Naren remained quiet. But sometimes when she was alone with David Miller, she would become very endearing. Especially when he helped with firewood or laundry, she would quietly come over and hand him a small handkerchief, saying, "Are you tired? Take a rest." Whenever this happened, David Miller felt overwhelmed. The three were different, but they all gave him care and love. One day, Jalgala said she had been feeling nauseous and vomiting since morning. At first, he thought nothing of it, but after a day or two, she was examined by an elderly woman in the village. The result was pregnancy. Jalgala was shocked, as if by a bolt from the blue, but at the same time, she also showed a look of relief. Finally, a child was coming. According to family tradition, this was a very good thing, and in fact, Jalgala herself had been waiting for the time of childbirth. Jalgala made a loving joke to David Miller, saying, "It seems you've sown your seeds well." David Miller was startled, thinking in shock, "Am I really going to be a father?" He thought the probability was low because of his age, but before the mysteries of nature, human calculations were futile. But this joy was short-lived, as a few days later, Oyan also complained of similar symptoms. Oyan joked with a laugh, "I wonder if I'm pregnant too." But when the elderly woman examined her, it was indeed pregnancy. He could hardly believe it. David Miller was speechless for a moment. Jalgala and Oyan were confirmed pregnant with only a half-month interval. The sisters embraced, cheering excitedly while massaging their bellies. A family celebration erupted. The youngest, Naren, was also confirmed pregnant about a month later. Miller himself could hardly believe this was possible. Although already over 50, he not only had one child, but was having children with 3 sisters. "The sisters are truly a miracle," he said with tears in his eyes, expressing gratitude. The villagers were immersed in a festive atmosphere. The occasion, the elders were delighted, saying, "It's been a long time since such a golden age." David Miller felt embarrassed by the attention of the whole world focused on him, but at the same time, he also felt proud and responsible. In the early stages of pregnancy, they all experienced morning sickness, fatigue, and dizziness. David Miller carefully looked after them. He reduced his other tasks and did his best to ensure the sisters had no difficulties with food and followed the prenatal care methods taught by the village elders. Most importantly, providing prenatal care for 3 pregnant women simultaneously. In an inland village rather than a city hospital was difficult. However, this place had a long-standing knack for childbirth. Without external medical care, people were optimistic that women who had delivered children for decades could do so without any major issues. The sisters seemed filled with joy, even though they complained of some discomfort as their bellies gradually grew. They would gather every day to chat, saying, "We'll be having babies soon." Every evening, as David Miller talked with the 3 sisters, he felt complex emotions. To live here forever kept surfacing. The sisters said, "You don't have to stay forever. But it would be great if you could live with us for a few years after the children are born. It would be too difficult for us to manage on our own." They said honestly, Narin shyly said, "I initially said you could leave, but actually, all 3 of us hope you'll stay in the village." David Miller was swayed. "Okay," he said, "I promise not to leave for now." A few more days passed, and when Jalgala Oyan and Naren were about 4 to 5 months pregnant, a sandstorm and other natural disasters struck the village. Yurts shook, and livestock were startled and ran off. The sisters had to endure the chaos. In their heavy state, David Miller quickly drove moving the goats and sheep to a safe place and removing rolling stones around the yurts, carrying out protection efforts. Thanks to this, they passed through without major damage. But the sisters were so surprised that they felt they had hovered between life and death. That night, all 3 embraced David Miller, murmuring, "What would we do without you?" David Miller comforted his sisters, saying, "I will protect you. I will do my best, no matter the circumstances." He cherished them even more as each of the 3 was carrying a child. The entire village clearly showed its dependence on him. Finally, the delivery Dates approached. First, Jalgala felt labor pains with her full belly, and the elderly women prepared in the yurt using simple birthing methods. David Miller's hands and feet trembled nervously, but as he saw Jalgala struggling in immense pain, he felt the urge to do something. Fortunately, the elderly woman with decades of experience guided the entire process well, and after a few hours, the strong cry of a baby was heard. A baby was born. Jalgala's hair was disheveled with sweat, but she smiled faintly as she held the baby. David Miller's eyes also grew hot, and he was speechless. His memory of perhaps having experienced childbirth once in the United States resurfaced, but this was now a child born in a completely different environment with a completely different woman. He was overwhelmed by the infinitely tiny and mysterious life. A few weeks later, process. It was said that, true to her lively self, even during labor pains, she would mix in jokes like, "Save me, I'm dying," which made people laugh. As soon as the baby was born, she almost lost all her strength, but upon hearing the baby's cry, she immediately sobered up. "I can't believe this is my baby." Oyen shed tears as she caressed the baby's fingers. David Miller also watched nervously nearby, and when it was all safely over, his legs almost gave out. Finally, the youngest, Naren, gave birth to a child. The 3 babies were born with approximately 3 months between each birth. Naren didn't make much noise during labor pains, as she wasn't very vocal. Instead, she held back her tears, and whenever the elderly women said, "You must be more energetic, don't cry, give me strength," she quietly complied. And at a certain moment, the baby came into the world. Naren embraced the baby and said, "David, you did well, you're truly wonderful," and tightly squeezed his hand. Finally, the brides successively gave birth to each child. It was a series of births happening at different times, but all within just a few months. The village was overjoyed, reaching a fever pitch. 3 babies being born in such a short time was excellent, meaning future generations would become even more prosperous. They congratulated them, saying the family's life had grown stronger. David Miller felt the joy and responsibility of becoming a father. Honestly, it was hard to believe he was raising 3 newborns, but thanks to the sisters' unity and the village community's help, things progressed smoothly. Every morning he would be woken by the baby's cries, but his fatigue would disappear. When he saw the children adorably suckling now, the brides and David Miller lived in the same yurt, caring for the 3 children together. Since the babies woke up in shifts every night, the 3 sisters took turns caring for one baby, and sometimes David Miller would hug and comfort 1 or 2. This was a situation he could never have imagined in the United States, but here, it was common for several people to live in one yurt, and because the entire family raised the children together, it was less difficult. Naturally, David Miller became very busy. Early in the morning, while the sisters were feeding the babies, he would go out of the village to chop firewood or tend to the livestock. When David Miller returned, the sisters would report, "You've worked hard. Our babies are doing such and such today." The village elders would occasionally come to check on the baby's health and praise David Miller, saying, "He truly is a remarkable man. He's still working so hard at his age." Sometimes, Oyen would hum American pop songs to lull the babies to sleep. Jalgala, like a mature adult, would responsibly plan even while raising the children. Worrying about how to prepare clothes when they were slightly older, or how to obtain milk or formula. Naren quietly and silently watched the babies, and at some point, she would quietly tell David Miller that she was grateful for him embracing the family's children so fully in such daily life. David Miller felt he was being reborn. He had shed his divorce pain and stagnation from the United States and built a completely different family in a completely different place. Furthermore, with 3 newborns born carrying his seed simultaneously, he had become the center of a large family he had never imagined. Sometimes, he would miss civilization. He thought of food from his homeland, the United States, comfortable shower facilities, and internet connection. But the innocent smiles of the sisters and children made the regrets disappear. Moreover, there was no fierce competition here, no worries about money, and no corporate superiors. Of course, there was difficult physical labor and the danger of natural disasters, but there was a warmth of communal living here, as the newborns became more stable and postpartum recovery was achieved. David Miller began seriously discussing long-term residence with his sisters. Now that the children were growing a bit, shouldn't they consider city life for their education and in other aspects? Oyan actively agreed. I want to live in the city once and teach the children to write. Jalgala cautiously agreed, saying, our village has no schools or hospitals, so moving to the city, or at least closer to a town, might be the right thing to do at some point. Naren also nodded slightly. However, the issues were money and legal matters. Even if they only moved within Mongolia, they would have to go to Ulaanbaatar to find housing or rooms, and living expenses wouldn't be easy either. Furthermore, if David Miller was considering going back to the United States, complicated administrative procedures such as the children's birth certificates and the sisters' visa could become a problem, Jalgala said. If you're willing, I'd like to go abroad with you, but all three of us would have to go at the same time, and with 3 children. She shook her head. David Miller thought it wasn't the stage to make a decision yet. First, let's let the children do better here and discuss it in detail again when they're a bit older and can travel. I can go back to the United States to prepare a certain amount of money, or I can first live in a Mongolian city, he suggested. The sisters all agreed with this viewpoint. The village elders also said, if raising the children becomes inconvenient for you, you can leave for the city on your own. We wish for you to stay, but we respect your freedom. David Miller was somewhat moved by these words, and on the other hand, he also felt apologetic. Even if I were to leave one day, would they be okay? However, they seemed adaptable, as they had long experienced situations where outside men came in and only left behind children. Ultimately, David Miller, the brides, and the newborns lived as one large family under one roof, continuing the village's communal life. When the babies were about 1 year old, it was noisy and bustling, but David Miller felt happy seeing the sisters take turns caring for them. Here was a peaceful family harmony he couldn't have achieved in the United States. These days, he would sometimes drive an SUV to areas near the city, or at least find a hospital in town to get them vaccinated. Each time, the 3 sisters and 3 children accompanied him. The car was crowded at the hospital. The doctor smiled and said, "Oh, a father having 3 newborns at once. That's truly amazing." David Miller's language wasn't very fluent, but he could communicate roughly because the sisters would translate. Thus, he gradually interacted with external civilization. Even in the village, with 3 babies born, there was much energy. The adults were very satisfied, remarking that after a long time, the house was finally filled with the cries of children. David Miller had also reached a stage where he didn't hesitate to exchange drinks and jokes with several people in the village. He was no longer a traveler who stayed for only a few days and left. He felt he was now a true member. Sometimes at night, he would build a fire in front of the yurt and gaze at the stars, thinking, how did my life unfold this way? I simultaneously gained the freedom I so yearned for and new love and responsibilities, even in strong winds. With the brides beside him, the yurt where the children slept felt like a sanctuary that couldn't be exchanged for anything in the world. The noisy and complex civilization seemed long forgotten, and the Mongolian land and wind embraced him. Sometimes he felt disheartened because he had no place to return to. But now, at least in this place, he had 3 wives and 3 family. When he thought of this, his heart would warm, and he felt a new sense of responsibility and hope. This family would continue for decades, until the children grew up and this inland region would care for them. In the inland regions of Mongolia, the seasons flow harshly. In winter, temperatures can drop to tens of degrees below zero, and in summer, heat and sandstorms strike. Nomads have adapted and live within these conditions. Similarly, David Miller, his 3 sisters, and their children might face many trials. In the future, the children might fall ill. Financial difficulties might arise, or natural disasters might occur, but they would overcome it hand in hand in the name of family and by uniting with the customs and community spirit of this Mongolian tribe. Now, a newborn cried in the yurt, and the sisters busily comforted him, while David Miller also got up to help when Oyan called out, "I'll hold you today, so go comfort Naran's baby." Jalgala said, "I'll prepare the meal." Their appearance was somehow chaotic, but it was a warm and ordinary daily life of a family. There, a family dynamic completely different from the normal framework in the United States existed. Yet it was filled with sincerity, caring for and cherishing each other more than anyone else. Life continued thus. Deep in Mongolia's boundless steppe, the sun set, and at night, glittering stars covered the entire sky. Beneath it, in a yurt lit by a small lamp, resided a man in his 50s who had once been trapped in isolation, and his brides, who formed the family he now had to protect. Now, there were also 3 infants who had just come into this world. This family, which seems strange at first glance, had actually transformed into a precious relationship for each other. The ending remained uncertain. This family might experience many stories and choices, but one thing David Miller realized: life is only once. And if you can achieve love and unity in any way, that is enough to be worthwhile. His encounter with the 3 sisters brought him the freedom he had been seeking and another form of responsibility. This was enough to change his life thereafter. As a result, an unconventional relationship that began with a foreigner's visit ultimately brought new vitality to inland Mongolia. The sisters each successfully continued their family line by bearing children, and the villagers also blessed them. David Miller was also considered a member of the village, and gradually took root in this land. One day, even if the children grew up and left to explore the wider world, the dedication formed on the steppe, in the yurt, and with his new family, would never change. Perhaps one day David Miller would take the children to the United States. At that time, people around them might be surprised, saying, "Impossible, a man with 3 sisters and children." But isn't life always an unpredictable adventure? At this moment, stars twinkled over the steppe, and the yurt was filled with warmth and the laughter of family. Thank you for watching today.